Welcome to another edition of the Official Jets podcast powered by Amazon Web Services. It is Monday, April 6th, 1:30 p.m. On today's episode, double draft duty here. EA and I caught up with Daniel Jeremiah of NFL Network. He does a great job there, and we talked, of course, all things draft. And then later on in the show, we'll hear from Dane Brugler of The Athletic, and Dane and I go through different Jets scenarios, rounds 1 through 3. So you don't want to miss that as the draft just a couple weeks away here. But first things first, EA, how you holding up over there in Florham Park?
Green's beautiful day. Sun is out. I'm going to make sure I get my solitary exercise in. But hey, listen, the draft is only 2.5 weeks away, Greens. It is happening. It is going to provide a great diversion and an outlet for sports fans, specifically NFL fans and Jets fans. So I'm getting pumped for this virtual draft. It's not what we thought it would be, but we're going to make do and make this the best thing possible.
All right, first things first, NFL draft analyst Daniel Jeremiah. Here's the interview, and EA and I will break down right after. Goes without saying, but first things first, how has this pandemic been affecting your day-to-day basis and then really affecting the draft and how to evaluate these prospects?
Well, you know what? First of all, our family, our thoughts and prayers with everybody in your area there, because I know what we have in California is one thing. What you guys have been dealing with work is totally different. So we're thinking about you guys, praying for your community. But for me personally, I may be one of the only people. It hasn't really been that different. I didn't get a chance to go out to Money Pro Days, which I would have probably gone out to another 6 or 7 pro days. But other than that, I mean, I'm home, I'm watching tape, I'm preparing for the draft, looking at different teams on the phone, which it's been interesting because with the general managers all at home right now, there's not as many people popping in their offices. So I've actually had more conversations with GMs around the league in the last few weeks than I have prior to any other draft. So it's been good for me from a communication standpoint. Obviously the kids are home, doing school from home, but my kids are a little bit older. My youngest is 12. So they're self-sufficient and everybody's doing quite well.
Great to hear that everybody is doing well. DJ, you were a former area scout yourself before you took the job at NFL Network in 2012. How do you think it's impacting those guys, specifically area scouts, national scouts, the guys who were on the ground throughout the year, and now the elimination of pro days, the elimination of the prospect visits to the facility? How have things changed, and how are guys relying on the computers now as far as getting to know the prospects at the end of the process?
Well, first of all, I think you're going to find out who was diligent during the fall and who were the guys that weren't procrastinating, saying, oh, I've got time. I can talk to this person on campus when I'm there for the pro day. I can catch up with this player at another point in time down the road. If you were diligent and really doing your homework on these kids through the fall as an area scout or a cross-checker, national scout, it's going to really benefit you during this time because, again, we can all figure out the players. You can watch the tape and figure out who can play and who can't play. The challenge, and a lot of times you miss on these players because you don't get to know the person. And you've had chances now with a good number of these guys to be around them a little bit in the fall, out at practices, talking with coaches and seeing them practice live in person, go to games, see them at all-star games, see them at the combine. To me, I think there's enough there to really get a good handle on these guys if you've been doing your work. Now, in terms of some of the scheme stuff, as the coaches come into the process, how do these guys retain your information that you want to see? Teams are trying to be creative with that, with Skype and FaceTime, doing something like we're doing right here. Get a chance to email the kid a playbook, a really, tiny playbook, and then say, hey, we're going to Skype you, get in touch with you tomorrow, and we'll go over these things. And you're really, it's almost like recruiting because you're allowed a couple of contacts with these kids per week. So I know some prospects and talking to them, some teams, multiple times a week, they're having basically these sessions with them to really get to know them. So look, you find a way. Don't be the guy that is sitting in your house as a general manager saying, well, we're screwed this year. What am I supposed to do? Now figure it out, find a way and figure it out. And I think most people are doing that.
So the Jets have 4 picks in the top 79, and if you were to look at their needs per se entering this offseason, you'd probably say receiver, tackle, edge, and corner. So if you're Joe Douglas, like, what's your ideal scenario here in those top 79 picks, the 4 selections there?
Well, I would look at it and just say a couple of those positions being filled. I think you pretty much hit on all of them. In a perfect world, you get one of your top tackles to fall to 11. And, is that guy going to be there? I mean, there could be, 3 or potentially even the top 4 guys go. If the top 4 guys are gone, I don't see them taking the 5th player at that spot. And to be honest with you, I don't know the order that they have them, but I would imagine it might even be a case where it's the top 3. If one of your top 3 tackles is there, you pick them. You've got to address that, even with what you've done. I like Fant. It's a high upside signing there in free agency. Chuma Adoga's got a lot of ability, but he's not there yet. I still think there's a need at the tackle position. So that's the perfect world where that's there for you at 11. Now with these picks, with the 2 and the 2 3s, now you get a combination of a receiver, a corner, an edge rusher, whoever the best available player is. And I have a feeling that if they don't go receiver at 11, man, they're going to have some really intriguing options there in the second round.
You've been doing some great things on your Twitter account at Move the Sticks. I watch you every day. Very recently, you were looking at Jets wide receiver coach Sean Jefferson's son, Van Jefferson, and you have a lot of good thoughts towards him. Let me ask you something, though. The wide receiver group this year, tremendous depth, and everybody like yourself has been talking about that. Give me a couple other position groups that you really like down the line, maybe beyond the first round, in terms of depth.
Yeah, well, look, you've got the receiver position. I think the running back position is a really solid, deep group. I think that's going to kind of go into the 3rd, 4th round. You're going to see good backs there. Another one, when you look at the linebacker position before the combine, I'd kind of done a once over on this linebacker class. I wasn't super excited about it. And then, man, you watch all these guys run and work out, go back, you watch more tape. I think there's more depth there than maybe we initially thought. Now, that's an area the Jets are in good position. I don't see them going linebacker anytime early in the draft, but there is some depth there. Corner is solid. It's a solid group. I maybe a little bit disappointed with where we ended up at that position, but I think there is some depth in that 2nd, 3rd round. Guys like Damon Arnett, guys like Jeff Gladney from TCU. I think those are good 2nd round type players. They're going to be there when the Jets are picking if they wanted to go with a corner. But really, to me, I would say that the position that really stood out the most outside receiver would probably be running back.
So in terms of receiver for somebody like EA, and you talked about on your Twitter, like Van Jefferson, even somebody like Brian Edwards out of South Carolina, who didn't have an opportunity to participate in the Senior Bowl, the Combine, like how much is their stock affected by not being able to show these teams that, 1, they're healthy, and 2, just not having the athletic testing that they could have proved at the Combine?
I think the athletic testing is not as big a deal. The medical that's the whole thing, so where are they health wise? And this is the challenge for these players and for these teams. It's really the biggest hurdle they have to overcome is trying to get updated medical information on these players. So, in free agency, they were very proactive in terms of sharing information. And, I'd be anxious to see how this thing all comes together with these combine recheck players that aren't going to be available to be rechecked. So it's going to be kind of on those agents to get updated information to these clubs so they can be comfortable with where these guys are at health-wise. But I do think there's probably a round penalty, which means Van Jefferson probably, there's a chance he could have gotten the 2nd round. I think he's a phenomenal player. But because of this, a little uncertainty there, maybe that he drifts into the 3rd, maybe potentially even to the 4th round. But I would say the 3rd round is probably his sweet spot. And it's like that for a whole host of players. Edwards is another one. There's a little bit of a concern with his top speed, but his game is all about physicality and toughness and contested catches. So I don't think that will cause him to drop. Just trying to get, the updated medical information is going to be the challenge.
DJ, do you like the way Joe Douglas did approach free agency? He targeted needs. He set ceilings in terms of his targets. He also said, we're going to wrap a bow around Sam Darnold. We got to protect our franchise quarterback. And also he talked about flexibility in terms of, hey, listen, I don't want to go into the draft and have this glaring need. So What did you think about how he kind of maneuvered throughout the first couple weeks of free agency?
Well, I thought he did a good job. Joe had a plan in talking with him prior to free agency. He had it mapped out of kind of what he wanted to do and what he wanted to get accomplished. He wasn't going to come out there, firing in that first wave. They were going to have numbers and stay within that budget. And, the good thing, the exciting thing, if you're a Jets fan out there is, this team right now, they've filled holes. They can take the best available player at pick number 11. That's the first thing. The second thing is when you forecast into the future, and we got this year coming up, but once you get to 2021 and get to that free agent class, there is tremendous flexibility and opportunity for the Jets to make a big push in the next offseason with free agency. The way this is set up with the 1-year contracts, with some other contracts they're going to be able to get out from under, there's going to be a lot of freedom and a lot of liberty there to make a big push. So this is exciting. It's kind of like, I feel like with Joe, if you to a pool, you kind of go down to the bottom and then you can spring up. And I think right now you're getting a chance to see them kind of come up off the bottom. And I think next year you're going to see this thing really take off with some of the people they're going to be able to add to this mix. But to me, this offseason was going to be about the draft first and foremost, and free agency was going to supplement what they do in the draft. But to me, the key additions for the Jets in the offseason have yet to come. They're coming here in a couple weeks.
Mm-hmm.
DJ, so EA and I have talked about this too. Joe Douglas is his first time as general manager, so you can't really get a feel for how he wants to operate outside of seeing who he learned from. And you think of guys like Ozzie Newsome and Howie Roseman. And when talking about trading up, not at 11, but the Jets have capital in the third round to potentially make a move up into the second round or even to the back end of the first round. Can you just kind of talk about philosophically why that could benefit Joe Douglas and the Jets?
Well, I think you can make an argument for that. I don't see that happening. I think if you see the Jets move around in this draft, they're going to move back. Joe's very confident in his evaluating ability. He's confident in the group that he's assembled around him, led by guys like Phil Savage, Rex Hogan. These guys are outstanding. So to have confidence there in a draft that's good in those middle rounds, I think you're trying to add to that number, not subtract from it. So, short of potentially their number one tackle being on the board at number 9, and maybe they could go up just 2 spots and wouldn't be quite as costly. I think that would be, potential opportunity there. But again, I would say more than likely you're talking about if you're going to move, you're moving back to get extra picks. There's still a lot of holes on this roster. And this year, the second, third round picks, those are too valuable to part with, in my opinion.
Do you think there would be a group of players there at 11 if there is a run on quarterbacks early where maybe a team calls Joe and says, okay, we'll give you an extra 2 or an extra 3 to move back 2 or 3 slots in that first round, where you might potentially, do you think there's a situation where you could have a group of players together at that tackle position and potentially wide receiver and say, hey, maybe it's our best bet to go back because I do have a stack here that have similar ratings on our board?
Yeah, I think especially if the top tackles go, to me, there's a case you can make to trade back because there's, if you're going to go receiver, there are so many good options there. So if somebody else has one that they're particularly in love with and they want to give you a nice price, a team like Denver that's picking 15, where you wouldn't have to slide back too far. The Raiders picking right behind them, a team that looks to be in the wide receiver market, could be one of those deals where you get a little something just to slide back 1 spot. So I think those opportunities would present themselves. I just don't see, if there's a tackle that they really like, I can't envision a way they would trade off of that pick instead of sitting there right then filling a need on this football team. And it goes back to the theme that you guys mentioned. Joe knows he's got to protect Sam Darnold. Is going to go as far as Sam Darnold can take this team. So that to me is number one priority. And if you've got a tackle that you feel good about, you don't trade that pick.
All right, DJ, we appreciate you coming on NewYorkJets.com, and stay safe out there in California.
You guys be safe, man. It's great to catch up with you guys. All the best.
Okay, so obviously a great interview with Daniel Jeremiah, who's, like he said, one of the only people who's not affected by the stay-at-home effect here and the quarantine rules, because this is basically his time to self-quarantine, preparing for the NFL draft. But what I thought was interesting in terms of Daniel Jeremiah's interview was that he basically said the way that the Jets have gone about their free agency so far, it allows them so much flexibility in 2021, and same thing for the draft. And it seems like the emphasis that DJ placed was really on next season.
Well, he's the first guy who actually has spoken about 2021 with the Jets, saying that the free agency class next year looks very good on paper. And the one thing that I got out of Joe Douglas last week that struck with me, well, I guess a ton of things, but what struck with me was depth. He wanted to build the depth of this roster, and he certainly did that so far in free agency. Now, if you're looking for the Jets to make a splash, maybe they make a splash in the draft. Maybe they make a splash or two in 2021 in free agency, but that was definitely not the plan here this spring in free agency.
All right, and looking ahead now, let's hear from Dane Brugler of The Athletic, who, like I said, we do a weekly segment on NewYorkJets.com, so you can also check it out there in video form. But Dane and I break down different scenarios for the Jets. So this week we talked about potential defensive players for the Jets at 11, offensive tackle options in round 2, and then, of course, capped off by wide receiver prospects in round 3. Dane, let's take a look at some scenarios here for the Jets as the draft just a couple weeks away. And an unpopular opinion, I'll say, in terms of mock drafts is if the Jets, in fact, take a defensive player at 11. So do you see that more as a trade back scenario, or are there, in fact, players not named Jeff Okudah, not named Chase Young, that are worthy enough of that 11th pick?
Yeah, I think so. And a trade back's always an option. But if they stay put at 11, I think most of us, both fans and analysts, we would agree that offensive tackle, wide receiver, that looks like the two biggest needs and probably the two most realistic options in the first round. But, if the draft played out exactly like we expected every year, this wouldn't be any fun. So let's keep an open mind and let's talk about, players on the defensive side who could be there at 11 and would be worthy of consideration. And I think it starts at edge rusher with K'Lavon Chaisson. After Chase Young, there's a little bit of a drop off at pass rusher, but good chance that Chaisson from LSU is that next pass rusher off the board, somewhere in the top 15 or 16 picks. He has that twitchy athleticism, the body bend where he can capture the corner, he can drop, play in space. He's still maturing physically and technically. But I think you'd like to see him be a little more advanced with his counters, how he uses his hands, but he's a high ceiling edge defender. And, when you look at the Jets and, bringing back Jordan Jenkins on 1-year deal, that looks like a smart move. But I think that no one would look at that depth chart and say, okay, they're done building at pass rusher. They could use some more help. And I think Chaisson would certainly give them that. Now, if they want to go in the secondary, I think that's also an option that would make sense. And it's similar to pass rusher where, there's an Ohio State defender at the top. You look at cornerback, Jeff Okudah, the almost near consensus top corner in this draft. But there's a little bit of a drop off after him. And then Florida's CJ Henderson, I think he's like Chaisson, projected to go somewhere in the top 15, 16 picks. And he would make a lot of sense right there at 11. He's over 6'1". He's a 4'3" athlete, plays sticky coverage. I wish he were a little bit better of a tackler. I wish he was more of a playmaker when you watch him on film. But he's going to be a starting corner in the NFL for a long time. And the Jets could certainly use a guy like that.
So the Jets and Joe Douglas clearly want to build this offensive line, and the draft is predicated on unpredictability. So let's say that the Jets don't go offensive tackle in round 1, and to your point, do take a defensive player. If they were to go offensive tackle in round 2, who are some names that make sense there?
The one that really stands out is Isiah Wilson from Georgia, a massive human being, 6'6.5", 350 pounds, 35.5-inch arm length. And he's not a bad athlete for a guy that size. He makes it tough on rushers to run the arc, to win inside. And then in the run game, he creates movement with that brute strength, the mean streak that he has. You do wish he was a little more technically refined with his hands. He's only a redshirt sophomore, so the fundamentals, I think, are still catching up with the natural skill. and that leaves him leaning in space, laboring a little bit. So a little bit of a work in progress as a technician, and his personality might not be for everybody, but that's why we're talking about him in the second round, not the first round. So he has NFL starting potential. He just might need a little bit of time. And I tell you what, that second round is tough for these tackles because we're going to see 6 or 7 go in the first round, and then there's a little bit of a drop off that I don't see many of those tackles falling to the mid-second round. But then I don't think that it might be a little bit of a reach to take one of those third-round tackles like a Matt Parrott from UConn or Tega Winogo from Auburn. Some of these guys, it might be, where the Jets are sitting in the second round, might be too early for them. So Isiah Wilson might be kind of that perfect compromise there in the mid-second.
If we were to talk about receiver now in the third round, a lot of fans would be like, what's going on here? Why didn't you select a receiver in rounds 1 or 2? But you and I have talked about this before, and I think it's pretty well documented across the league how rich this receiver class is. So if the Jets were to select a receiver in round 3, they have 2 picks in the third round. Like, are we talking about a day 1 contributor, even potentially a day 1 starter? And who are some names that you think make sense?
Yeah, and that's exactly it. Because of the volume of receivers in this draft that are going to go on day 2, especially guys that can make an instant impact, guys that can come in and be productive. So one of the guys I have my eye on for a team like the Jets is a prospect who unfortunately hasn't had a great draft process, but that's also why he could be available in the third round. And that's South Carolina's Bryan Edwards. He had a minor knee issue that forced him to miss the last game of the year, forced him to miss the Senior Bowl, and then he broke his foot training for the combine. So he's missed basically the entire pre-draft process, and that could cause him to slip a little bit because we don't have the testing numbers on him before the draft. And in this crowded receiver class, that could be the difference. Why a guy like Colin Johnson or some of these other receivers could go ahead of him. Van Jefferson, who's also dealing with his own injury stuff. But that could be great news for a team picking in the third round, looking for receiver help. And with Edwards specifically, 6'3", 215 pounds, big-bodied receiver. You see that on slants, screens, crossers. Needs to be a little bit more reliable finishing catches, especially down the field. But the athletic skills, the physicality, that's what really can make him an NFL weapon inside or outside.
You mentioned Bryan Edwards. You also mentioned Van Jefferson, 2 people that have been dealing with injuries in this pre-draft process. Given the status of the world right now with the coronavirus pandemic, how does this affect their stock with no pro day, with no medical recheck? How has the evaluation process changed?
It's definitely an unprecedented process. With not having the pro days, not having the medical rechecks, not having the visits, the 30 visits, that's really the big thing, because when teams invite these guys to the facility, that's when they can have their medical team, do a checkup and find out more about a guy like Van Jefferson who had the Jones fracture in his foot. They can get an update on that. How is that healing? Bryan Edwards had the broken foot. Get an update on that. What's going on with that? Even from a broader perspective, Tua Tagovailoa, how will that affect him in the early portion of the draft? So it's really going to have a ripple effect. And some teams are going to be a little more risk adverse with how they'll be a little more conservative with guys where they know the testing, they know the medicals, but then you have a team that might have a little more appetite for the risk and take a chance on one of these guys who might fall a little bit. He's got that discount sticker on him because there's a little more risk involved, but it could be a high reward type of situation, and that could be the case with a guy like Bryan Edwards or Van Jefferson.
So basically what you're saying is, Jets fans, don't be alarmed if Joe Douglas decides to take a receiver in round 3, considering this receiver class has a chance to be historic. Dane, thanks a lot, and we'll talk to you next week.
Great. Thanks, Ethan.
All right, there you have it, Brugler's Draft Board, and that was Dane Brugler. EA, you watch a lot of college football, and Dane talked about somebody out of South Carolina named Bryan Edwards, the receiver who had a lot of hype coming into this year. What do you think about a guy like Bryan Edwards?
Well, I go back to South Carolina and think about the receivers they had on the outside. He was a teammate of Deebo Samuel's. Now, different player. He's not a burner in any means, but he's a guy who's tough. He'll run good routes. He'll get the contested ball. And in a deep wide receiver class, he is a guy to really watch out for, probably on day 3, right, Greens?
Yeah, Brian Edwards, what stuck out to me, what Dane said, he's one of those guys that has the discount sticker on him because teams can't access medical information, or they can't have their teams conduct physicals that you would normally do on a top 30 visit because they just don't exist anymore, the top 30 visits, unless it's through FaceTime and it's virtual. So the independent doctors might, to Dane's point, might not be so independent and might be a little biased to try to help a player improve his draft status. So a player like Brian Edwards, Van Jefferson, another one, Laviska Shenault, just going off different receivers who banged up during the pre-draft process and don't have an opportunity to really prove themselves and improve their draft status. So I think it'll be interesting to see where guys who have medical questions go. Obviously, Tua Tagovailoa is a headliner there, but we'll see what happens in just a couple of weeks. Again, April 23rd to April 25th, and it's going to be a weird draft considering it's probably all going to be virtual in some capacity. We just don't know the details yet. That was another edition of the Official Jets podcast powered by Amazon Web Services. Very special edition of the episode tomorrow. We got Joe Douglas one-on-one with EA, Brian Billick with Olivia. You don't want to miss it, EA. Stay safe, and I'll talk to you tomorrow.
All right, brother.